Welcome to our meeting on budgeting, our lecture. So I want to show you where we are. We're in Lesson 4, Unit 4, Lesson 3 Budget. We're going to go over the budget slideshow. This document is just here to show you what an actual budget looks like. This is a real budget from a prior job I had. It goes over $1 million worth of expenditures and revenue. And then these are, these are the assignments for your budget sheet, and we're going to look at all of these as well. So let's start with the PowerPoint. So this lecture is on how to build a budget, and everybody does a budget slightly differently. But I'm going to talk to you about the way I do it and give you some suggestions. This is a very different paper than anything we've done all semester. It's very math related, and people either love it or hate it. Usually there's no in between. I personally love budgets. I think they're a lot of fun, but very few people feel that way. So here is what has to happen when you're identifying a budget. And I've been asking you this all semester. I've been asking you to think about what you need to make your program work. So how many people do you need to hire? How many supplies do you need? What kind of equipment do you need? And we'll talk about the difference between supplies and equipment when we look at the budget. How much time does it take to do something? How much money does it cost to plan, implement, and evaluate? And how much travel is required? These are all important questions to ask yourself when you're building a budget. So then the next thing that happens is you have what you want and what you need and what the grant allows. So some of you have talked about paying for health care, and you need to make sure your grant allows you to pay for health care. Sometimes grants do not allow you to pay for specific things like health care. Very few grants allow you to purchase buildings. They often let you rent space, but they don't let you build a building. So you might have to go back over and look at your grant. If you think back to the original grant assignment, one of the questions I asked you was, what are you allowed, on what can you spend your money and what can you not spend your money? And so that should actually be in that assignment you did in the beginning of the semester. So next you have to find out what everything costs. And one thing is, how do you find salaries? And the next slide should have some examples of how to find salaries. And there's two websites, I think, that are in this slide presentation for you to use. The next one, how do you find the cost of equipment and supplies? And equipments are usually, it depends on the grant. Sometimes equipment is described as something that costs over $2,500. My definition of equipment is stable. If you buy a printer, that's equipment. If you buy a van to do portable health center stuff, that's equipment. Supplies are things that you use and they go away. So a supply is something like condoms. The penis model would be equipment. Diabetic teaching supplies, things that go away, would be that you have to buy repeatedly. Those are supplies. So the next thing is to talk about is consultants. Employees get benefits and consultants don't, and we'll talk about that when we look at salaries. And if we don't talk about it enough in detail in this lecture, just remind me to go over it on Thursday. When you pay someone a salary, you have to pay benefits, and in the budget sheets that you get, the benefits will be calculated for you. And those are things like health insurance, retirement, vacation days, sick leave. The workplace also has to pay for workers' comp insurance, unemployment insurance, and things like that. There's also something called indirect costs, and indirect costs are what your organization gets for running the grant. And so, for example, when you have a grant, someone has to write the checks to pay the bills. Somebody manages your budget in a budget office. There's electricity that's used. There's heat and air conditioning that's used. So if we were running a grant at Towson University, we would be using their internet, we would be using space, we would be using air conditioning and heat, desks maybe, and so all of that is called indirect costs. And so whenever you have a grant, you're allowed to charge indirect costs, which go to help pay for all of that extra stuff. How much do people get paid for travel? Travel expenses are dictated by the federal government, and right now it's slightly over 50 cents a mile, but people get paid per mile for driving their cars, and I'll show you how to do that when we look at the budgets. And I don't think any of your grants, I don't think any of your grants have matching funds, so we don't need to worry about that. So here are two websites where you can go to look at salaries. Supposedly, these are going to work. I don't know that they will. I'm not going to do this now, but what you can do is if this doesn't open on your computer at home, even though I put the link in, it's not working. So if they don't work by clicking on them, you will open them. So let me just we'll come back to that. But when you open these, and we'll look at these in class, once these are open, what you find is you can actually search for an organization. And so here we go. We're going to connect to something. My internet at home is very, very slow. So this is Glassdoor, and I live in York, Pennsylvania, so that's what comes up. But let's say you want to hire a social worker. And you want to hire that person in York, Pennsylvania. So you look up salaries. I'm looking up salaries for a social worker in York, Pennsylvania. And when you click on that search thing, it tells you this is what the national average is. This is what York, Pennsylvania is. So there's the minimum and maximum, and this is the average or the median. So let's go back and let's look up. You can see it's like 47,000. Let's not look in York, Pennsylvania. Oops, that was a mess. Let's look at a social worker in Alaska. So it was $44,000 for a social worker in York, Pennsylvania. If your program were running out of Alaska, you see that in Alaska they make more money, not much more money. But no matter where you go, whatever job you're looking for, you can put in here and you can get an estimate of what that salary would be. So there's this site, and then the other site that was on there was Indeed. So either one of those work. You can look at both of them if you want, but those are ways to figure out how much people make in salary. When someone is a consultant, that person makes more money per hour than an employee. And that's because consultants do not get benefits. They don't get health insurance, retirement, any of those benefits. So they make more money per hour because they have to buy all of that on their own. So if you were hiring a social worker as an employee, that's the salary. If you were hiring one as a consultant, which is less than 27 hours a week, then you would pay them more. So with the Affordable Care Act, and it's still in place, full-time is considered over 27 hours a week. So if you're hiring someone over 27 hours a week, it's an employee. If it's under 27 hours a week, you have the option to make them an employee or a consultant. So then you have to figure out, you might want 5 people, but you can only afford 1.5. So you need to actually, as we're building the budget, you're going to have to make hard decisions about how you're going to spend your money. And we'll look at that briefly when we look at the actual budget sheets. So you don't ever want to go over or under budget in certain line items. And when we look at the budget, you're going to see there's different areas. you are allowed to move a specified amount of money without permission from the granting agency. However, if you go over that amount, you will need permission. So there's some places they will always allow you to move money from, and there's other places that they will never allow you to move money. So anything that's spent directly on your population, they will never let you take the money out of that area and put it into something else. They will almost always allow you to take money from something else and put it into a direct service to your population. So for example, when I worked on a grant once, it took 6 or 7 months for me to be hired. So the first year, they only paid me 5 months of the 12-month salary they had allotted. So we had quite a chunk of money to spend. And they allowed us to move like $75,000 out of salary into buying supplies for the grant because those supplies service the population. If we had asked to take money away from supplies for the population and put it into salary or put it into travel expenses, they would say no. So there's certain places in your budget that you should try to over budget, and there's certain places that you should try to under budget, knowing this. And we'll look at those when we look at your budget sheets. So you have 2 budgets that you're going to do. You're going to do a budget and a budget narrative. They're almost identical. They're both in Excel spreadsheets, and the budget narrative has more detail. People often get confused about what a budget narrative is. It is not an essay about your budget. It is an Excel spreadsheet that has more detail, and we're going to look at that when we look at the budget sheets. So that's the end of that slideshow. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at some budget sheets. So I'm going to be pulling these sheets up down here. First, I'm going to pull up the budget narrative because that is the more complicated of the 2. Here's the budget narrative. So these budget sheets that are in your, I thought I fixed that. We'll see. So these budget sheets that are in there you are allowed to use. And you have year 1, year 2, year 3, and then it subtotals it. Any cell that has any kind of color or shading, you should not delete anything, because every one of the cells that's colored or highlighted has an equation in it for you. So for example, this equation, it says the sum of these 3 items. So as you put things in here, like if I were going to hire a social worker contractually and I paid them $10,000 the first year and $20,000 the second year, and $22,000 the third year, this equation in here will add for me. And so you don't ever want to change anything in there. Those items will change automatically as you add or subtract items in the white cells. Let me delete everything out of there. So these numbers automatically will add. And so we're going to go through the budget line items. This is the budget narrative. And what makes this a narrative is this column right here. This column explains exactly how you get these figures. So for example, the first category for all of your budgets is personnel. You have to identify who you're hiring. If I were hiring 2 instructors, I could put both instructors in the same row. Okay? So this says that I'm going to hire a director. The director will spend 50% of her time on the grant. The director makes $60,000 a year. 50% of $60,000 is $30,000, and there's a 3% COLA included. So COLA is cost of living adjustment. And every year people get a COLA. Well, I can't say every year. Almost every year people get a COLA. The acceptable COLA, or cost of living adjustment, is 3%. So each year you have to add 3%. So to do that, you take year 1 and you multiply it by 1.03. That's 103%. So it's all of this plus 3%. So if you multiply this by 1.03, that goes here. If you multiply this by 1.03, that goes here. That math you have to do yourself. So then we have an instructor, and it says what the instructor's only working part-time. The instructor's not hired first year for this grant, so that's what they make. And the secretary for this grant, excuse me, makes is only 10% of her time, or 1 day a week, 1 day every 2 weeks, I think it is, she spends on this grant. And that's her salary. But you always have to add the 3% COLA. It doesn't say 3% COLA here, but you have to add a 3% COLA every time. So there's a lot of spaces here. You can add as many people as you would like. The last space is someone who is not going to get benefits, even though that person is considered full-time. So this person's working 75% of a full-time week, and that's how much money they make. They're not getting a cost of living because what we're doing is we're paying part of their graduate assistant salary. So what happens here is this will add up all your salaries, and it will add up 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and then it will add a total of all 3 years. So that's what happens there. This next section is called fringe benefits, and this is the benefits that I was talking about before. In this grant that you're submitting, the benefits will come to 32% of the salary. And this has, there's the equation, this is 32% of whatever the salary is for the director. So these columns all have equations in them, and because they have equations in them, everything will be calculated for you. Okay. So it will automatically happen. If you accidentally hit enter or delete, if you hit enter or delete, you will delete the equation. If that happens, you're either going to need to figure out how to put the equation back in, or you're going to need to start over with a new form. Okay, so and there the graduate doesn't get benefits. So then it's saying that for equipment and supplies for my grant, I need 10 laptops, 1 for each site. I'm getting them the second year. Software, laboratory committed, I need BSE models. This is for the breast cancer grant. I want 30 models. There'll be 3 models at each center or trainer, and that comes to $4,500. If you needed breast models, what you would do is you would Google breast models, and you would come up with prices. If you need condoms, for example, for teaching, those condoms can be expired. They're really cheap. If you need condoms because you're giving them out, then they're more expensive. If you're buying any kind of medical equipment that you're just using for training, you can get older equipment, or you can get equipment that's been used. But if you're getting equipment that you're actually going to give to people to use, that needs to be new. But then you can look up and you can Google it. I know what a lot of things cost, and I will look them up, and I will tell you, I think you're crazy. Like if you were to tell me that you were buying 30 breast models and it cost $20,000, I'd be like, that's wrong. Because breast models only cost about $150 each. And then here at the bottom you have office supplies. So they would let you take money out of office supplies and put it someplace else. They would not let you take money from this area, the breast models, because that's directly for your population. They would probably let you take money from here. So anything that's for your population, you want to put a little extra money in there, but it has to be whatever you explain here. You have to explain how you get to this. I'm getting 30 models. They're $150 each. That's $4,500. So communications, the only thing I have here in this spreadsheet, you may add other things, is how much it costs for a phone, and this is for 1 phone. Then right here it tells you what the mileage is, and here is what you have to multiply right here. So right there it says 0.525 cents mileage, and that is that it costs 0.525 cents per mile. So if you travel 100 miles, you multiply it by 0.525 and you'll get $52.50. You have to remember that this point is the cents. If you think back to how you write money, decimal point, and then change. So if you have to remember to multiply by 0.525. If you multiply by 52.5 cents, that would actually be $52.50. So this is the number you want to multiply. You take your miles and you multiply it by this, and it gives you the money. Okay. All right. You are required to do some traveling in all of your grants locally, and all of you are required to attend one national conference a year. And so when you're doing this, you have to explain here how you get this money. You have to tell how much airfare is, how much the hotel is, how many nights, and you're allowed to charge $50 a day for food reimbursement. If you spend $100 a day on food, you will only be reimbursed for $50. So that's the way it's calculated. It's estimated that that's a reasonable amount of money for you to spend, and so that's what you use, $50 a day. So you need to do all this math here for the person reading the grant, so they're just going to look and check to make sure it's correct. Then it totals your travel. In my grant that I'm showing you, I don't have any consultants. So consultants are people who are not full-time, who you're hiring contractually. They might work 10 hours a week, they might work 30 hours a week, but only 6 months of the year. And so that totals up your consultants. And then contractual are things that you're not buying, but you're going to pretty much rent. So for example, if you wanted to buy a van, that would go up in equipment. But if you wanted to rent a van, or you wanted to have bus service and you were going to utilize a bus company, those are all contractual things. If you're having trainings or workshops of any kind and there's food, that goes under contractual. And so once you put all your contractual in, it's all added up. This is the direct cost. So this is how much money I'm spending when you add everything up together. This is for 3 years. And then what happens is I have these indirect costs. So this will automatically be calculated for you. If this changes, this will change. So you have to be very careful, because if you have, this grant was for $325,000 over 3 years. If I have $325,000 to spend, I cannot spend it all here, because this is just direct costs. I have to have enough money left to have indirect costs. The way grants work is that you always round up. If this were $324,666.04, it would still round up to the next dollar. So this number that you'll put in here will be rounded up. This number has to be what you're allowed to, you need to get as close as possible to the maximum amount of money you have to spend without going over. So that is the budget narrative, and the key issue for the budget narrative is this column right here. This column is what makes it the narrative. Your budget and your budget narrative must be the same. They must be identical, except for this one column. So let me move this over here. Let me go up to personnel. So here we are at the top of both budgets. This is the budget, this is the budget narrative. This budget narrative has the narrative column of what we're spending, but everything else is the same. If you were to look at these 3 numbers, all these numbers are the same. My recommendation for you is to do this first and then take out this column. I wouldn't delete it. I would just delete the words that are in it, and then you will have 2 budgets that are exactly the same, the budget and the budget narrative. This seems complicated. Like I said, these papers that you're writing now are not hard. They're just very time consuming. So that's what the budget and budget narrative look like. And here is the scoring rubric for the budget narrative. I already had that open, sorry. So right here, when I look at your budget, what's interesting, the first time you turn in your budget, I'm looking at your budget without your programming. So I don't know if it's 100% accurate. What I will look at is, does it align with the overall goals of the grant? And is it the allowed request for funds? You can't go over, because if you go over in your budget, it will automatically go away. And if you go under, I will take points off, because you need to get as close as possible as you can. Then I'm going to look to see if it aligns with the program development objectives and assessment. Then, are the budget amounts accurate and realistic based on current market costs? And I've told you how to look that up. It's in the correct format, and the narrative is thorough, succinct, accurate. It matches the document. So I'm going to be looking, do you describe this thoroughly enough that I can actually figure out how you're doing it? This is worth 45 points, and then there's 5 points in spelling and grammar. So that's the budget. I know we're going to have to talk about it again because it's hard to talk about when you're not in person, but you just need to start to play with it. The big deal with these budgets is do not mess with any of the colored cells. The colored cells have equations in them that you are not allowed to change. So here's the budget narrative. You can type in all the white cells, but the colored cells or the shaded cells will automatically change as you put money in. So that concludes this lecture. I know it's long, I know it's hard to follow, not in person, but try to play with this a little bit before we have class again, and then we'll be able to talk some more about what to do with your budgets. Thank you again for being flexible on this, not having any electricity today at the college. And what we'll be doing is we will go over it on Thursday, any questions you have after the interns leave. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next class.